Welcome, dear listener. Imagine drifting awake not in your own bed, but beneath the heavy folds of embroidered linen, fur, and wool. The room around you is dim and cool, its walls thick with stone that both protects and imprisons. A faint glow of daylight filters through slit windows, narrow openings designed less for light than for defense. The air is laced with the mingled scents of last night's fire, slightly damp stone, and the faint aroma of rushes scattered across the floor. This is the royal bedchamber of a medieval monarch, part sanctuary, part fortress, and entirely unlike the bedrooms we know today. The bed itself is a marvel. Far more than a place to sleep, it is a symbol of wealth and prestige. 4 great posts rise like towers, supporting a canopy of velvet and silk that shuts out both drafts and prying eyes. Curtains of heavy cloth can be pulled closed around the bed, transforming it into a private world within a world. At night, when the fires die low, the canopy holds in what little warmth remains. By day, it becomes a throne of rest, a place where the king or queen might sit upright to receive courtiers, sign documents, or even hold private meetings. Waking is not a private act here. Unlike the solitude of modern mornings, a royal morning begins as a small ceremony. The first sounds are not alarms or birdsong, but the quiet knock of attendants, the shuffle of slippers across cold stone floors, and the whispered exchange of servants making sure all is prepared. The groom of the stool, a strangely important official, whose duties were far less glamorous than his title might suggest, was often the first to enter, followed by chamberlains and ladies in waiting, each responsible for a different part of the ritual. The curtains are drawn back, allowing in the pale light. Servants bow low, their movements rehearsed, for even the act of waking must honor the crown. A basin of water is set nearby, sometimes warmed, often cold, for the monarch to wash face and hands. Linen towels are offered, held carefully so that no servant's hand touches the royal skin directly. The simple act of splashing water on the face becomes a declaration: the ruler is awake, and therefore so is the kingdom. The chamber itself is both practical and ceremonial. At one end sits a great wooden chest, bound with iron, where clothing and linens are stored. On another wall hangs a tapestry depicting scenes of battle, saints, or perhaps a family crest. These tapestries are not only decoration but insulation, keeping out the chill of the stone walls. A small fire smolders in the hearth, tended through the night by servants to ensure the air does not grow unbearably frigid. Furniture is sparse but symbolic: a carved chair, an oaken table, a few stools, all crafted to impress rather than comfort. Every piece is heavy, immovable, a reflection of power rather than luxury. A gilded crucifix may hang near the bed, a reminder that kings and queens rule not only by might but by divine will, or so they believe. As the monarch rises, attendants help with the first layers of clothing. Nightshirts of linen give way to warm undergarments, stockings, and woolen tunics. Depending on the season, furs may be draped around the shoulders, or lighter silks chosen for the day ahead. Each garment carries meaning, colors signify alliances, fabrics reflect wealth, and styles whisper of foreign influences brought by trade or conquest. While dressing, the monarch may listen to the first reports of the day. A chamberlain might murmur news from the night watch, travelers arriving at the gates, disturbances in the town, or messages from distant lands. In these quiet morning moments, decisions begin to take shape. Should a tax be adjusted? Should a messenger be dispatched? Should an audience be granted? Even before breakfast, the machinery of rule is in motion. And yet, beneath the grandeur lies a surprising vulnerability. Despite the titles and treasures, a medieval king or queen begins the day much like anyone else's, stretching sore limbs, blinking at the morning light, and bracing against the chill. The mattress beneath them may be stuffed with straw, feathers, or down, but it is never entirely free of lumps or pests. Fleas and lice respected no crown, and even royalty scratched in the morning. The sounds of the castle begin to stir as well. From beyond the chamber walls come the echoes of boots on flagstones, the creak of drawbridges, and the clang of buckets from the kitchens below. The royal rooster, if you will, is not a crowing bird, but the murmur of servants carrying trays, the bark of guards changing shifts, and the faint rumble of hooves in the courtyard as horses are prepared for the day. There is a rhythm to this life, both foreign and strangely familiar. We too wake, wash, and dress. We too prepare for the day's duties. But where our mornings are private, the medieval royal's awakening is public theatre. Each bow, each word, each movement reinforces the delicate balance of power. To see the king or queen rise is to see the kingdom rise with them. And so, the day begins not with haste, but with ritual. The royal bedchamber, dim and fragrant with smoke and stone, becomes the stage on which the first act of rule is performed. The monarch, once just a sleeper, is now the embodiment of authority, with a breath of cool air and the weight of velvet upon their shoulders. They step out of the warmth of bed into the long, strange day of medieval royalty. The morning of a medieval monarch was not complete without ritual, and at the heart of these strange ceremonies was one of the most peculiar positions in royal history, the groom of the stool. The very name invites a smile today, but in the Middle Ages and into the Tudor courts, it was a role of astonishing intimacy, responsibility, and, believe it or not, political power. Imagine, if you will, the quiet moments after the monarch had risen from bed. Attendants drew aside the curtains, washed the royal face and hands, and began to prepare clothing. But before the day could truly start, there came the matter of nature's call. Even the most powerful king or queen could not escape the needs of the body. And here entered the groom of the stool. The stool referred not to a chair but to a portable commode, essentially a finely crafted wooden box lined with a chamber pot, often padded with velvet or cloth for comfort. The groom's duty was straightforward yet extraordinary: to manage this personal aspect of the monarch's life. He ensured the stool was clean, placed it where needed, and, most astonishingly, sometimes assisted directly. To modern ears, it sounds undignified, yet in a society where privacy was rare and bodily functions were viewed differently, this task carried no shame. In fact, the groom of the stool became one of the closest confidants of the ruler. To be entrusted with such an intimate responsibility meant access to the king or queen at their most vulnerable, away from the pomp of court. Conversations that might never occur in the council chamber flowed in these quiet, unguarded moments. Secrets were shared. Opinions were asked. Trust was cemented. Because of this closeness, the groom often rose to extraordinary influence. He handled not only the stool, but also the monarch's finances, personal correspondence, and access to the royal presence. In some cases, the groom became one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, shaping policies and advising decisions from a position no one else could claim. What began as a humble and rather earthy duty transformed into a gateway to the heart of power. Once this delicate ritual was complete, the rest of the morning unfolded in layers of ceremony. Washing continued, now more elaborate. Servants presented basins of water scented with herbs, lavender, rosemary, or mint, to freshen the senses. Towels of fine linen were held out, and oils or perfumes dabbed onto the skin. The monarch's hair was brushed or covered with a coif, depending on the fashion of the time. The act of dressing was itself a performance. Each garment had meaning, and each layer required its own attendant. Undergarments of linen first, then hose, then tunic or kirtle. For kings, doublets and jerkins gave form and structure. For queens, gowns with long trailing sleeves or stiff bodices displayed both majesty and wealth. Rich fabrics, silk, brocade, velvet, spoke louder than words, announcing alliances with merchants and kingdoms from afar. Even the colors mattered: crimson for power, blue for piety, gold for divine favor. As this was happening, officials began to arrive at the edge of the chamber. Courtiers and advisors waited for their moment, careful not to intrude too soon. The monarch's morning was both intimate and political, a liminal time when the ruler shifted from human to symbol. What began in bedchambers ended in audience halls, but this transition passed through the careful choreography of servants and rituals. Meals too were part of the routine. A breaking of the fast might consist of bread, and small portions of meat or fish, though the spread was more lavish in wealthier courts. Trenchers of bread served as plates, and cups of spiced wine or warmed milk might be offered. This meal was not always heavy, but it was ceremonial. Sharing food with select attendants reinforced loyalty. Each sip and bite was part of the performance of monarchy. We must pause here to notice something curious. Where we modern folk prize privacy in the morning, medieval royalty lived in constant company. To sleep, wake, wash, and even relieve oneself, all were witnessed. The individual dissolved into the role of sovereign. A king was never just a man, a queen never just a woman. Their bodies were, in a sense, public property, bound up in the mythology of divine right and the machinery of state. And yet, in these strange rituals, there is also a kind of humanity. Imagine the monarch sighing at cold water, shivering as attendants lace a garment too tightly, or exchanging a small joke with the groom of the stool. These fleeting moments of ordinary discomfort or humor made them more than statues or portraits. They were living beings navigating the same basic rhythms of life we know today. By mid-morning, the transformation was complete. The groom of the stool, his duties finished, returned to overseeing accounts or letters, wielding his influence quietly behind the scenes. The monarch, now fully dressed and perfumed, stepped into the day's larger stage. Advisors approached, courtiers bowed, and the rituals of power began anew. But the echoes of those private hours lingered. The strange intimacy of morning, its ceremonies, its attendants, its careful steps, set the tone for all that followed. To wake a king or queen was to awaken a kingdom, and even the humblest ritual, performed faithfully, stitched the fabric of authority together. So the morning rituals ended, not with a flourish, but with a steady continuation of duty. The groom of the stool retreated into history as a symbol of both absurdity and power, yet his presence reminds us that kings and queens, however mighty, were also profoundly human. Chapter 3: Breakfast in the Great Hall. The morning light, filtered through narrow stained glass windows, spilled into the great hall like colored ribbons. The monarch, freshly washed, robed, and perfumed, now made the slow procession from private chambers to the heart of the castle. The place where breakfast, ritual, and politics wove together. To picture a medieval breakfast in the royal sense, we must first cast aside modern ideas of cereal, coffee, or bacon sizzling on a pan. Food in these early hours was far more symbolic than satisfying. In fact, for much of the medieval period, what we'd call breakfast was often skipped entirely by ordinary folk, considered unnecessary or even a sign of indulgence. Yet for kings and queens, the ritual of a morning meal was about more than hunger. It was about performance. The great hall itself was not simply a dining room. It was the nerve center of the castle, a vast, draughty chamber with high beams, banners fluttering overhead, and long trestle tables stretching into the shadows. At one end, a raised dais held the monarch's seat, a chair larger and more ornate than any other, sometimes draped in rich fabrics to remind all present who held authority. Servants scurried before the arrival of the king or queen. Fires were stoked to push back the chill. Bread trenchers were cut, their insides scooped to form makeshift plates. Pewter cups, shining when polished but often dull with use, were set out beside pitchers of ale and watered wine. The scents of roasting meat or stewing oats drifted faintly from the kitchens below, mingling with the tang of wood smoke. When the monarch entered, silence fell. All rose to their feet. Courtiers, advisors, and petitioners bowed low, while household staff froze in their places. Only after the monarch was seated could others resume their movements. Even something as ordinary as sitting down to eat became an act of reverence. The meal itself might seem sparse to us, though rich compared to the fare of peasants. A slice of coarse bread, spread with butter or honey. Small cuts of cold meat, left over from the previous night's feast. A soft, boiled egg occasionally. Ale or weak wine to wash it down. On special days, spiced cakes or dried fruits might appear, their sweetness a rare indulgence. What made this breakfast remarkable was not the food, but the audience. Courtiers jostled for positions close to the monarch's table. To be seen sharing in even the smallest meal was a mark of favor. Whispers traveled quickly in these spaces. An offhand remark by the king could ripple into decisions that shaped the realm. A queen's smile at a favored lady in waiting could spark envy or hope among others. Petitioners sometimes waited for this very moment, hoping to press their requests when the monarch seemed most approachable. A knight might seek funding for a campaign. A merchant could plead for rights to trade. Even clergy found their way to these tables, sliding in quiet counsel between bites of bread. Meanwhile, entertainment was never far away. Minstrels or jesters might perform soft tunes, careful not to overwhelm the solemnity of the moment. On winter mornings, the hum of voices and strum of lutes warmed the otherwise cold hall, while in summer the doors stood open, letting in birdsong and the scent of blooming herbs from the outer gardens. But let us not mistake this ritual for relaxation. The monarch's meal was also a court in miniature. Every gesture was watched. Did the king frown at the bread? The baker's position might be in danger. Did the queen push aside her cup? The steward would be summoned to explain the wine's quality. Servants lived in constant tension, balancing speed with precision, hoping to avoid notice except when praised. And yet, beneath the grandeur, a quiet ordinariness persisted. The king might bite into bread too hard for his teeth and mutter with annoyance. The queen might laugh at a jest told under the breath of a lady in waiting. These tiny fractures in ceremony reminded all that monarchs, however elevated, were still bound by the same human hungers as their subjects. Breakfast also marked a transition in the day. Once the trenchers were cleared and the last cup drained, the tone shifted. Courtiers moved from pleasantries to politics. Advisors brought forward documents, sealed letters, and matters requiring attention. The monarch, still seated at the head of the hall, might listen to grievances or settle disputes. The meal ended, but the audience had begun. Meanwhile, beyond the royal table, the lower ranks of the household ate their own morning fare. Pages and squires took bread crusts and weak ale at the far ends of the hall. Kitchen staff slipped scraps into their aprons, too busy with preparations for the midday feast to linger. Guards at the doors chewed quietly while keeping watch. Thus, within one chamber, the full spectrum of medieval life unfolded. From sovereign majesty to humble labor, all bound together by bread and ale. We can almost hear the scrape of trenchers, the clink of pewter, the low murmur of voices, and the crackle of fire. To sleep, perhaps, is to drift into that hall, warmed by the sounds of routine and ritual. The meal ends, but the echoes linger, like a morning bell carrying across the cold stone walls of the castle. By the time the monarch rose, the great hall returned to its normal rhythm. Servants cleared the tables, courtiers dispersed to chambers and corridors, and the kitchens below prepared for the day's true feast to come. The monarch, however, stepped into the next stage of duty: audiences, councils, and the weight of rule. But for a moment, in that hall, breakfast was both an anchor and a stage, a reminder that even in grandeur, the day begins with bread. Imagine, for a moment, stepping into the royal wardrobe of a medieval monarch. Not simply a closet, but an entire chamber, or several chambers, filled with fabrics, furs, and jewels so extravagant that each garment carried more weight than just thread. To clothe a king or queen was not about comfort, it was about authority, divine right, and the visual declaration that they were unlike anyone else in the realm. The wardrobe itself was overseen by officers and attendants whose sole duty was to manage the clothing and regalia of the crown. These keepers of cloth were not mere servants. They held positions of trust, for garments were valuable assets, often worth more than entire villages. Bolts of imported silk from the east, dyed in colors rare and precious, lay stacked in cedar chests. Furs, ermine, sable, fox, and marten lined long cloaks designed to keep out the bitter cold of drafty castles. Embroideries glittered with gold thread, each stitch crafted by skilled hands who might spend months on a single piece. The act of dressing was itself a ritual. Monarchs did not simply slip on tunics or gowns. Layers were carefully chosen and fitted by attendants. First came linen undershirts, crisp and cool against the skin, a small luxury in an age when laundering was arduous. Over these went tunics or gowns of wool or silk, their colors rich, deep crimson, royal blue, or the near impossible shade of purple, long associated with emperors. Every detail spoke of rank. Ordinary peasants might wear brown or grey wool spun at home, but monarchs wore fabrics dyed with pigments ground from rare minerals or imported plants. To wear a robe of scarlet, achieved with the costly Kermes dye from Mediterranean insects, was to broadcast wealth and reach. Gold thread embroidery glimmered in firelight, catching the eye from across the great hall. Pearls and gemstones were sewn directly into garments, transforming cloth into treasure. Cloaks and mantles played their own role in the wardrobe. Heavy furs in winter, lighter silks in summer, always clasped with ornate brooches of silver or gold. A cloak was not simply a shield against the elements, it was a moving canvas of power. When a king walked into a hall trailing a mantle embroidered with the crest of his house, there was no mistaking his authority. When a queen processed to mass in a gown shimmering with pearls, she became not just a figure but an icon, reflecting divine favor. Footwear, too, carried meaning. Soft leather boots or pointed shoes of fine cloth marked wealth, for peasants trudged in rough boots or barefoot. Gloves of silk, lined with fur, were slipped onto royal hands not only for warmth, but as emblems of dignity. Even belts were heavy with meaning, ornamented with silver plates or gilded buckles, symbols of readiness and command. Jewelry completed the picture. Crowns, naturally, were the most visible symbols, but they were reserved for ceremonies. Day to day, monarchs might wear circlets of gold, rings heavy with gems, or reliquary pendants said to contain fragments of saints' bones. These objects were more than decoration. They linked the ruler to heaven, suggesting that divine approval wrapped them as securely as their cloak. The wardrobe was also deeply practical. In an age of limited hygiene, garments were changed frequently not only for appearances, but to mask odors. Attendants brushed and repaired clothing daily, patching precious fabrics rather than discarding them. Inventories were kept, for garments could be gifted as rewards or pledged as collateral for loans. In fact, the royal wardrobe was so significant that it became a financial department of its own in many kingdoms, responsible not just for clothing, but for the safekeeping of regalia, jewels, and even records. Dressing, however, was not a private matter. It was a performance. Monarchs often dressed before an audience of attendants, advisors, and favored courtiers. To be present during this ritual was a mark of intimacy and trust. The order of who held the cloak, who tied the girdle, and who fastened the mantle reflected hierarchies of power. A squire permitted to lace the king's boots might boast of the honor for life. A lady entrusted to arrange the queen's headdress stepped closer to influence than most could dream. Headdresses and crowns deserve their own attention. Queens wore elaborate hennons, tall, cone-shaped constructions draped with veils, or intricate nets of gold threads studded with jewels. Kings favored circlets, caps of maintenance, or velvet-lined crowns for great occasions. Even the simplest headwear was lined with meaning, for to cover one's head was a mark of both dignity and humility before God. Beyond symbolism, there was comfort, or the attempt at it. Castles were cold, their stone walls holding winter chill. Layer upon layer of linen, wool, and fur offered insulation. Heavy cloaks swept floors and doubled as blankets when travel demanded nights in drafty halls. Yet, paradoxically, this grandeur was not always convenient. Long sleeves could drag in mud, jeweled hems snagged on benches, and cumbersome crowns caused headaches. To wear majesty was also to bear its burdens, but the wardrobe did more than clothe a body, it clothed a story. Each garment connected monarchs to their ancestors. Robes passed down generations, bearing the weight of tradition. A queen might wear the mantle of her grandmother at a coronation. A king might don a tunic woven in another land to signal alliance. Clothing became a language, each stitch a word in a sentence spoken to the world. And so, when the monarch emerged from chambers into the corridors of the castle, it was never simply a person who walked. It was an idea, draped in silks, armored in jewels, and crowned with history. Attendants trailed behind, ready to carry trains or adjust clasps, while courtiers bowed low, their eyes drawn as much to the cloth as to the figure within it. For the medieval monarch, the wardrobe was not vanity. It was necessity, a visible reminder to subjects that here stood a being set apart, chosen by God, destined to rule. Clothing was power, and power, like cloth, was woven thread by thread. The royal wardrobe complete, the monarch steps into the broader world of the castle. These walls are more than stone, they are a world unto themselves, alive with echoes of footsteps, murmurs of servants, and the hum of daily life that sustains a kingdom. To walk through the castle is to step through layers of history, power, and curious routines. The corridors are narrow, lit by torches sputtering against the damp chill of stone. Tapestries hang on the walls, not merely as decoration, but as insulation against the cold. Woven with images of hunts, battles, or biblical stories, they soften the echo of footsteps and remind every passerby of noble triumphs and piety. Beneath the monarch's boots, rushes or straw cover the floor, sometimes strewn with herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask odors. The first stop is often the great hall, the beating heart of the castle. Vast, vaulted, and smoky, it is where meals are taken, courts are held, and celebrations unfold. A walk through the hall at dawn reveals servants polishing long trestle tables, setting benches into place, and sweeping away the remnants of last night's feast. The air is thick with the mingled scents of wood smoke, tallow candles, and the faint tang of spilled oil. At the far end, the high table, raised on a dais, awaits the monarch and favored nobles. Its elevated position is a constant reminder of hierarchy, power made visible in every seating arrangement. Beyond the hall lies the chapel, a quieter space where daily prayers are offered. The monarch pauses here, for no walk through the castle is complete without a nod to the divine. Narrow windows let in shafts of colored light through stained glass, dappling the stone floor with hues of crimson and gold. A priest murmurs prayers, incense lingers in the air, and the echo of chants rises like a soft tide. For kings and queens, the chapel is not just a place of devotion but of image, for their presence affirms to all that their rule is sanctioned by God. From there, the monarch's steps might carry toward the kitchens. Though rarely entered by royal feet, the path passes close enough for the scents of roasting meats and spiced stews to drift upward. The kitchen is a hive of activity. Cooks shouting orders, pots clanging, fires roaring in great stone hearths. Spices from distant lands, pepper, cinnamon, saffron, transform simple fare into exotic dishes, flaunting the reach of the crown's trade and wealth. The castle itself smells of this labor, the comforting aroma of bread baking, the sharp tang of vinegar used for cleaning, and the ever-present undertone of smoke. Walking further, one encounters the barracks and armories. Here, squires polish breastplates, mend chainmail, and oil swords. The clatter of training fills the air as young knights spar in courtyards, their wooden practice swords striking with rhythmic theuds. For the monarch, passing through this space is a reminder of power's foundation, not only God and lineage, but steel and loyalty. The armory is an arsenal of authority, each spear and bow a pledge of defense. The castle's towers offer a different view. Spiral staircases, steep and narrow, climb upward, winding past arrow slits where a draft of cold air whistles through. Reaching the top, the monarch gazes out upon the surrounding lands. Fields stretch into the distance, dotted with cottages and smoke from peasant hearths. Rivers gleam like silver threads, forests press against the horizon, and beyond them, sometimes, the faint line of enemy lands. From these heights, the monarch is reminded of dominion, vast, fragile, and bound together by loyalty and fear. Yet the castle is not only about grandeur. Its darker corners tell another story. Down narrow steps lie the cellars and storerooms, stacked with barrels of oil, sacks of grain, and salted meats preserved for winter. Deeper still, the dungeons brood, damp and silent, their iron doors heavy with menace. Few monarchs walk here for long, the chill lingers, and the cries of prisoners haunt the imagination. Still, to acknowledge the dungeon is to recognize the castle's full reality, a place of both shelter and control. Returning to the main passages, the monarch encounters courtiers, guards, and petitioners. Every bow, every whispered, "Your Grace," affirms the delicate balance of ceremony. Servants hurry past with water jugs or armfuls of firewood. Pages carry messages from one wing to another. Courtiers linger in hopes of a word, a nod, a chance at favor. The monarch's walk is never solitary. It is a procession, even in the most mundane corridors. The architecture itself reflects this strange mixture of utility and splendor. Stone walls, thick and cold, are pierced by arrow slits that double as windows. Wooden beams creak underfoot. In the upper chambers reserved for nobility are slightly warmer, their walls hung with tapestries, their beds layered with furs. The monarch passes by guest rooms, where foreign envoys might sleep, their furnishings carefully chosen to impress. Every step through the castle is a lesson in contrast. Luxury and hardship exist side by side. Glittering jewels lie within a few rooms of dark, damp cells. Roaring fires warm the great hall, while icy draughts slip through cracks in remote corridors. The monarch's walk weaves through both extremes, a daily reminder of the strange, uneven reality of medieval life. As the morning unfolds, this walk is not merely exercise. It is ritual. To move through the castle is to survey one's domain, to remind both self and subject of the crown's presence. Each chamber echoes with history, each stone bears witness to generations who walked before. And so the monarch continues, cloak trailing, attendants in tow, their footsteps blending with the rhythm of the castle itself, a heartbeat of stone, fire, and life. Beyond the halls of stone and chambers of state, the medieval castle held its share of living curiosities. For kings and queens, animals were more than companions. They were symbols of wealth, power, and sometimes eccentric taste. To walk among the creatures kept by royalty was to glimpse both the tender and the strange sides of medieval life. It often began with dogs. Faithful, fierce, and endlessly varied, they followed monarchs everywhere. Great hounds padded alongside hunting parties, their sleek muscles and keen noses trained to chase deer or boar. Smaller lapdogs nestled in the laps of queens, their fur brushed smooth, their collars set with silver bells. These little creatures were as much fashion accessories as companions, and they warmed cold chambers better than any jewel. To own a rare breed of dog was to declare one's refinement, just as surely as a crown or a robe of silk. Horses, of course, were essential. No monarch could be seen without a stable filled with powerful destriers for battle, nimble palfreys for travel, and elegant coursers for display. Each animal was trained, groomed, and housed in stables that smelled of straw and leather. The bond between ruler and horse could be deep, for these creatures carried them into both triumph and danger. Chronicles sometimes lingered lovingly on a king's favorite steed, naming it as if it were another knight in the royal retinue. Yet medieval royalty did not stop at ordinary animals. The castle might also house creatures of surprising rarity. Falcons and hawks perched on gloved hands, their keen eyes and sharp talons central to the noble art of falconry. To watch a bird of prey soar and strike was both sport and spectacle, and only those of high rank could afford its expense. Hawks were gifted between rulers as tokens of diplomacy, each feathered messenger carrying a weight of respect and obligation. Some monarchs went further, turning their castles into miniature menageries. Exotic animals, brought from distant lands through trade or conquest, dazzled visitors and reinforced the mystique of royal power. Imagine the astonishment of a peasant catching sight of a lion pacing in an enclosure within castle walls, or a leopard chained near a courtyard. To possess such beasts was to suggest dominion over the farthest reaches of the known world. An elephant might lumber in from the east as a rare gift, while monkeys from Africa clambered in gilded cages, their antics both amusing and unsettling. These strange companions fascinated courtiers and terrified commoners, who saw in them something both magical and otherworldly. Cats, too, had their place, though their role was more humble. They prowled kitchens and storerooms, keeping grain supplies safe from rodents. Yet even cats could find themselves elevated, sitting on the lap of a queen, or curling near the hearth in private chambers. Their sleek independence lent them an air of mystery, and in some courts, they were treated with surprising affection. There were, however, stranger companions still. Chronicles mention monarchs who kept bears, wolves, or even trained deer. Some rulers indulged whims that seemed almost absurd: parrots that mimicked speech, peacocks strutting in courtyards with tails like jeweled fans, or gilded fish ponds stocked with carp for both sustenance and spectacle. Each unusual creature added to the sense of the castle as a world apart, a place where ordinary rules bent to the will of the crown. Care of these animals fell to a host of attendants: falconers, grooms, kennel masters, and keepers of the menagerie. Their duties were serious, for to neglect a royal pet was no small offense. The grooming of a prized hound, the feeding of a hawk, or the cleaning of a monkey's cage was not mere labor, but a contribution to the grandeur of the crown. These animals also wove themselves into ceremony. Hunting dogs thundered alongside monarchs during royal hunts, their cries echoing through forests as horns called out the chase. Hawks perched proudly on wrists at court, displayed before envoys as if to say, "Here is a ruler whose reach soars as high as the falcon flies." Even lapdogs had their symbolic role, quiet presences in the queen's chamber. They whispered of domesticity and refinement, softening the harder image of royal might. But companionship was not only symbolic. In the quiet hours of evening, a king might stroke the fur of his favorite hound, or a queen might cradle a small dog against her gown. Amid the weight of rule and the chill of stone walls, the warmth of an animal brought comfort. Chronicles, though filled with battles and treaties, sometimes pause to note the grief of a monarch who lost a beloved horse or hound. These were bonds as real as any political alliance, and they remind us that beneath crowns and ceremony, royalty shared the same affections as any person. Of course, there were also dangers. Exotic animals could be unpredictable. A chained bear might break loose, a leopard might lunge at an unwary attendant. Monkeys, amusing though they were, could bite or spread disease. Even dogs could spark conflict. The gifting of a prized hunting hound could seal or sour relations between lords. To manage the royal menagerie was not only to entertain, but to shoulder responsibility for creatures both wild and tame. And so the royal castle echoed, not just with the voices of people, but with the barks of dogs, the calls of hawks, the roars of lions, and the chatter of monkeys. It was a place alive with more than human life, each animal a thread in the tapestry of majesty. Whether pacing in gilded cages or curling at the foot of a royal bed, these companions added warmth, strangeness, and sometimes chaos to the daily rhythm of power. For in the end, the animals of royalty were mirrors. They reflected wealth, authority, whimsy, and the yearning for connection that lingers even beneath crowns. To walk through a medieval castle was to encounter not only lords and ladies, but creatures whose presence made the strange world of kings and queens stranger still, and, in its own way, more human. In the grand tapestry of medieval life, few threads were as entangled, and yet as strangely romanticized, as love and marriage among the nobility. Beneath the banners of chivalry and the songs of troubadours lay a world where love was often an art, a performance, and at times, a dangerous game. To speak of marriage in the medieval court was not to picture candlelit vows of affection, but rather a chessboard where kingdoms and fortunes shifted with each move. At the heart of the matter was duty. For kings, queens, dukes, and ladies of standing, marriage was less about the beating of hearts and more about the binding of lands. A royal union was a treaty written in flesh and blood, designed to secure borders, forge alliances, or settle disputes. The young princess, barely out of childhood, might find herself promised to a distant prince she had never met, her hand sealing a peace more binding than any parchment. Likewise, a lord might wed a nobler woman not for her smile, but for her dowry of castles, manors, or fertile fields. And yet, alongside this cold calculation bloomed something stranger: courtly love. It was less a reality than a performance, an elaborate dance of language and behavior that elevated desire into an art form. The troubadours of southern France sang of knights who pledged undying devotion to ladies often far above their station, weaving verses of longing, secrecy, and impossible fidelity. These songs painted a world where love was pure, noble, and hopelessly unattainable. A world where desire thrived not in fulfillment, but in yearning. Courtly love was not without its contradictions. It demanded that knights worship their ladies with humility and reverence, as if she were a saint upon a pedestal. Yet often, the lady was married to another man, making this love an open secret, tolerated so long as it did not threaten the order of things. To pledge oneself to a married noblewoman was not to scandalize, but to participate in a cultural ritual, a game of gestures, words, and tokens. A ribbon tied around a knight's arm, a glance across a hall, a secret verse exchanged. These small signs carried the weight of passion. Marriage, meanwhile, marched on in its pragmatic way. The church oversaw unions, blessing them as sacraments, while families negotiated contracts that listed dowries in cold detail. A bride's trousseau might include lands, livestock, or promises of soldiers, all noted in ink and witnessed by clerics. The ceremony itself was both sacred and practical, a moment where vows before God intertwined with obligations before men. Afterward, feasts filled halls with music, wine, and roasted meats, celebrations where alliances seemed less like treaties and more like joy. But even within the structure of duty, emotion found its way. Chronicles tell of kings who grew genuinely attached to their queens, of lords who cherished their wives beyond political necessity. At the same time, tales abound of jealousy, betrayal, and tragic unions. The court was alive with gossip, of mistresses kept in shadowed chambers, of liaisons that threatened dynasties, of queens accused of straying from the path of virtue. The heart might be silenced in marriage, but it beat fiercely in the corridors of courtly life. Women in this system bore both privilege and burden. A noblewoman might wield great influence through marriage, her dowry granting her a voice in political matters. Yet she was often viewed as a vessel for alliance, her body carrying heirs to secure a family's legacy. Some queens, however, broke the mold, bending the rules of duty to assert their own authority. Figures such as Eleanor of Aquitaine, famed for her wit and independence, shaped history through both her marriages and her unapologetic embrace of courtly ideals. The literature of the age echoed these tensions, from the stories of Lancelot and Guinevere to the verses of troubadours. Love was depicted as both exalted and dangerous. A knight's devotion could inspire noble deeds or lead him into ruin. A queen's affection could soften a king or shatter a court. To love truly was to risk scandal, for true love often stood at odds with arranged duty. And yet, these stories persisted, whispered in halls and sung beneath castle windows, feeding the longing for something more than contracts and treaties. The rituals of love were not confined to poetry alone. A knight might prove his devotion through tournaments. Justing beneath the gaze of his lady, he might send her gifts: a falcon, a jeweled brooch, or a simple flower plucked from the fields. She, in turn, might grant him a token, her favor worn into battle as a charm of protection. These exchanges blurred the lines between love, loyalty, and honor, binding emotion into the fabric of medieval chivalry. Marriage politics, however, were relentless. A princess who dreamed of poetry might be sent across seas to marry a king twice her age. A lord who longed for freedom might find himself bound by vows that secured his family's lands. The personal bowed again and again to the political, for in the medieval world, the survival of dynasties outweighed the desires of individuals. Yet even here, the ideals of courtly love offered a space of imagination, a world where hearts could wander, if only in verse. And so, in the medieval court, love lived in two worlds at once. One was cold, calculated, and merciless, its logic etched in ink and bloodlines. The other was fiery, whispered, and forbidden, its logic written in glances and poems. Together they wove a tapestry of longing and duty, a fabric both brittle and beautiful. To walk the halls of a medieval castle was to feel both the weight of alliances that bound kingdoms, and the quiet murmur of love that refused to be silenced. To enter the great hall of a medieval castle during a banquet was to step into a world where food, spectacle, and politics wove themselves together. These feasts were never simply about eating. They were performances, grand theatre staged with roast boars, golden goblets, and music echoing from vaulted ceilings. In a society where hierarchy defined every breath, the banquet was where power revealed itself, not only in crowns and swords, but in courses and ceremonies. Picture the hall first, a vast space lit by torches and chandeliers of dripping wax, the air thick with the scent of roasted meats, fresh bread, and spiced wine. Long trestle tables stretched across the room, covered with embroidered cloths. At the high table sat the lord, his lady, and the most honored guests. Their position elevated above the others was not mere comfort. It was a statement, visible proof of their authority. Beneath them, in descending order, sat knights, retainers, and visiting guests. At the far end of the hall, servants, minstrels, and lower-ranking folk might eat in humble corners. The arrangement itself was a map of the social order. The food on display was just as symbolic. Great platters of venison, pheasant, and swan roasted whole were carried in procession, not only to be consumed but admired. Spices like saffron and cinnamon, imported from distant lands along trade routes, announced wealth louder than trumpets. Sugar, rare and precious, might appear sculpted into elaborate figures or sweet confections. Even bread carried meaning, the finest white loaves for the lord and lady, coarser rye or barley for those further down the hall. What one ate, and how it was presented, revealed one's place in the world. Entertainment flowed with the food. Troubadours sang of love and valor. Jesters capered with sharp tongues, and jugglers tossed torches into the smoky air. Between courses, musicians played lutes and flutes, while storytellers spun tales of saints and heroes. Yet all of this was more than merriment. It was spectacle. The banquet was a stage where the host displayed not only generosity, but authority. To feed hundreds, to provide endless wine, to command the talents of musicians. These acts declared, I have the wealth and power to sustain not only myself but all of you. Feasting also had its rituals. The blessing of the food, the washing of hands in perfumed water, the toasts and oaths sworn over goblets. All these moments reinforced order and piety. The carving of meat, often performed with ceremonial precision, was entrusted to skilled servers, their gestures choreographed to impress. Even silence had its place. Before the first bite, the hall might pause in prayer, uniting nobles and common folk alike under the gaze of God. Yet beneath the glitter of candlelight, the banquet was also politics in disguise. A lord might use a feast to secure loyalty, offering places of honor to allies or deliberately seating rivals apart. Marriages were announced, treaties sealed, and alliances whispered over steaming bowls of broth. To share bread and wine was to share trust, and to exclude someone from the table was to mark them as an outsider. The hall became a theater of inclusion and exclusion, where every seat and every dish carried meaning. There was, too, the pageantry of the feast itself, the subtleties. These were dishes crafted not only for taste, but for astonishment. A pie might be presented that, when cut open, released live birds into the hall, fluttering among gasps and laughter. Sugar sculptures shaped like castles, or saints might decorate the tables, destined not to be eaten, but admired as symbols of wealth. Colored jellies, gilded loaves, or even meats dyed with saffron created a sense of wonder. The feast was not simply nourishment, it was art, meant to dazzle as much as to satisfy. For the servants who toiled behind the scenes, the feast was less glamorous. In smoky kitchens below stairs, cauldrons bubbled, spits turned with effort, and bread ovens blazed hot. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of workers labored unseen to ensure that the feast above unfolded seamlessly. Their sweat and toil powered the theater of power, though their own meals were far humbler. Scraps of meat, bowls of pottage, and coarse bread eaten quickly before returning to service. Not all feasts were joyous. During times of famine or war, lavish banquets could spark resentment, highlighting the divide between the lord's abundance and the peasant's hunger. Chroniclers record moments when great lords feasted, while their people starved, the torches of the hall casting shadows on suffering just beyond the castle gates. The very excess of a banquet could reveal the fragility of power, for wealth displayed too boldly invited envy, and envy invited rebellion. Yet for most who attended, the memory of a feast lingered like the echo of a song. The glow of candlelight, the warmth of spiced wine, the sound of laughter and music, these were moments that broke the monotony of toil and duty. To feast was to step briefly into a world of abundance, to taste the possibility of joy, even in an age of hardship. For the host, it was an investment in loyalty. For the guest, it was a reminder of the grandeur and order of the world. And so the medieval feast endures in memory as something more than a meal. It was a mirror of the age. Lavish and brutal, generous and calculated. In the clatter of goblets and the carving of meats, in the laughter of minstrels and the whispered negotiations at the high table, the feast revealed the soul of medieval society. It was power dressed in velvet and spice, authority gilded with sugar, faith mingled with wine. A banquet was never just dinner. It was the theatre of life itself, played out beneath the flicker of torchlight. To live in the medieval world was to live with faith as a constant companion. It shaped the calendar, dictated daily rhythms, and offered meaning in a world often fraught with hardship. For many, faith was not only a matter of prayer within a parish church, but also of movement, of setting out on the open road to seek holy places where the divine felt closer to earth. These journeys, called pilgrimages, became one of the defining experiences of medieval life. Imagine yourself waking before dawn, fastening a cloak around your shoulders, and stepping into the cool morning air. The village lies quiet behind you, while the road ahead stretches endlessly, winding toward shrines, cathedrals, and relics whispered to hold miraculous powers. A staff in hand, a small satchel of bread at your side, and perhaps a badge pinned to your cloak, declaring your destination, you join countless others on the same path. Some walk barefoot in penance, others ride donkeys or horses if wealth allows. For all, the road becomes a kind of living prayer. The reasons for pilgrimage were as varied as the travelers themselves. A farmer might set out in hopes of healing for a sick child. A knight might walk to seek forgiveness for blood spilled in battle. Widows and merchants, peasants and kings, all could become pilgrims, equalized by the dust and miles beneath their feet. For some, it was obligation, a vow fulfilled, a penance imposed by confession. For others, it was longing, a chance to touch the sacred and carry its blessing home. The destinations themselves were magnets of hope and awe. In England, Canterbury drew countless travelers after the martyrdom of Thomas Becket, whose blood was said to heal the sick. In Spain, Santiago de Compostela promised grace at the tomb of St. James, guiding pilgrims across mountains and plains marked by the scallop shell, its enduring symbol. To Rome, the eternal city, pilgrims flocked to the tombs of Peter and Paul, seeking the heart of Christendom. And for the most determined, the ultimate pilgrimage was to Jerusalem itself, where Christ had walked and suffered, though the journey was long, dangerous, and often bound up with the tides of crusade. The road to these shrines was no smooth path. Travelers faced hunger, storms, thieves, and the sheer exhaustion of endless miles. Inns were rare. So many relied on the hospitality of monasteries or the charity of villagers. Some roads grew famous for their dangers, where bandits lurked in forests or wolves prowled in the night. Yet pilgrims pressed on, buoyed by prayer, by song, and by the company of fellow travelers. To walk together, to share bread and stories by the roadside, was itself a comfort, forging bonds that could last a lifetime. Symbols marked their passage. Pilgrim badges, made of pewter or lead, were pinned proudly to cloaks and hats. Tiny tokens sold at shrines, stamped with the image of saints or relics. A scallop shell from Santiago, a cross from Jerusalem, a tiny ampulla of holy water from Canterbury. These were not trinkets, but proof of devotion, carried home as sacred souvenirs. They were signs of identity, announcing to the world, "I have walked the road, I have seen the holy place. I carry its blessing with me. Along the roads, towns and churches thrived. Inns sprang up to cater to weary travelers. Markets bustled with trade as pilgrims bought bread, cheese, and candles for the journey. Entire villages prospered from the flow of traffic. Cathedrals rose like mountains of stone, funded by offerings left at shrines. To be a town on a pilgrimage route was to be linked to something larger than oneself. A network of devotion that stretched across Europe, like veins carrying the lifeblood of faith. Yet the pilgrimage was not always solemn. Joy and song accompanied many journeys. Groups sang hymns together as they walked, their voices carrying across fields and valleys. Festivals at shrine towns burst with life, with vendors, musicians, and pilgrims arriving from far horizons. For a peasant who had never traveled beyond the next village, pilgrimage opened the world. A glimpse of distant lands, new dialects, new faces. It was both a religious duty and an adventure. At the shrine itself, the air shifted. Pilgrims knelt before relics encased in gold and crystal, bones of saints, drops of blood, scraps of cloth said to have touched Christ. Candles flickered like stars in the dim light, their smoke carrying prayers heavenward. Tears flowed freely as hands touched stone steps worn smooth by centuries of knees. Healing hope and forgiveness seemed close enough to touch, and for many, the shrine was the climax of a long journey, a moment of transcendence that could reshape a life. But the road home was just as important. Pilgrims returned to their villages with stories to tell, badges to show, and blessings to share. Some claimed miracles, others returned with deeper peace, and some with only tired feet, but a sense of having walked with God. Their tales rippled outward, inspiring others to take up the staff and join the flow of humanity on the pilgrim road. In the end, pilgrimage was more than travel. It was a metaphor for life itself, a journey of hardship, companionship, longing, and hope. It bound the medieval world together, from the poorest shepherd to the mightiest king, in the shared act of walking toward the sacred. Every mile was a prayer, every step a confession, every shrine a reminder that faith was not just something spoken, but something lived, mile after dusty mile. And so, when we think of the Middle Ages, with its castles and battles, its plagues and famines, we must also remember the roads filled with pilgrims. Cloaks dusty, staffs in hand, hearts lifted by song, they carried not just themselves, but the very spirit of an age that sought God, not only in churches, but on the open road. Few events in medieval history cast as long or as chilling a shadow as the Black Death. To imagine life in the 14th century without it is nearly impossible. It swept across Europe like a silent storm, reshaping not only populations, but also the very fabric of society. For those who lived through it, the world seemed to darken overnight, and winter itself took on new meaning, colder, lonelier, and far more uncertain. The plague's arrival was sudden and mysterious. Whispers began in distant ports of a sickness traveling along the great trade routes from Asia. Ships carried goods, silks, spices, grain, but also death hidden in the form of fleas on rats. By the time the disease reached European harbors in 1347, it spread with terrifying speed. Entire towns, once vibrant with markets and bells, fell silent as fear crept through their streets. Imagine waking to the toll of a church bell, rung not for morning prayers, but for yet another funeral. The air felt heavy with dread, as though even the breeze carried the sickness. Houses stood shuttered, their doors marked with crude signs of warning. Priests carried the last rites to doorsteps where families whispered prayers, terrified to let outsiders cross their thresholds. It was a season of shadows, where each cough might signal doom. The symptoms were brutal. Swollen lumps, called buboes, appeared under the arms or at the groin, blackened with infection. Fever burned, delirium set in, and within days life slipped away. Few survived once the signs appeared. The sheer swiftness of death left families stunned, unable to mourn before another was struck down. Graveyards overflowed, trenches were dug, and still the bodies piled high. The rhythm of daily life, fields, feasts, markets, was replaced by a rhythm of bells, spades, and silence. Winter made the suffering worse, with crops already failing in some regions and food stores running low. The sick found little nourishment to fight the plague. Cold huts with drafty walls offered little comfort, and smoke from fires filled the air with acrid haze. Some huddled together for warmth, but closeness only spread the disease more quickly. Others fled their villages, hoping escape might mean survival. Yet the roads were no refuge. The plague traveled with the people, creeping into monasteries, castles, and even royal courts. For the poor, the plague was devastation layered upon hardship. A peasant might lose not only family, but also neighbors and friends, leaving fields untended and communities hollow. In villages where half the population perished, silence replaced laughter, and the steady rhythms of life vanished. Even the great estates of nobles suffered, for without laborers, fields lay fallow and rents went unpaid. Death showed no respect for rank or wealth. It struck kings and beggars alike. And yet, amid the terror, strange responses arose. Some turned to faith with desperate fervor, joining processions, praying to saints, or wearing relics in hopes of protection. Others sought explanations, and tragically, suspicion often turned to scapegoats. Rumors spread that outsiders or minority groups poisoned wells, and violence followed in the wake of fear. In some places, whole communities were driven out or destroyed, adding cruelty to catastrophe. There were those, too, who abandoned restraint altogether. Convinced death was inevitable, they pursued pleasure in wild feasts and reckless abandon, dancing and drinking as if to defy the shadows. Chroniclers wrote of cities where taverns overflowed even as the dead lay unburied. For others, the plague inspired solitude. Hermits fled to the wilderness, monks shut themselves in cloisters, and families barricaded themselves inside their homes, refusing to touch the world beyond. The Black Death reshaped the medieval mind. With so many lives lost, estimates suggest a third, perhaps even half, of Europe's population perished. Society itself cracked and shifted. Labor grew scarce, giving surviving peasants new leverage. Old bonds of feudal duty loosened, wages rose in some places, and the authority of lords weakened. The church, unable to halt the plague despite prayers and rituals, saw its authority questioned. If even holy men fell, what did that mean for the power of faith? Doubt crept in, whispering alongside devotion, yet not all was despair. Out of the shadows came resilience. Communities rebuilt, though smaller. Families took in orphans. Survivors adapted to a world less crowded, where land once scarce became more abundant. Over time, art and literature reflected the trauma, filling pages and walls with images of death and reminders of life's fragility. The dance of skeletons in murals, the verses of poets haunted by loss, these became cultural echoes of the plague. For those who endured, memory never faded. The Black Death was more than an event, it was a turning point. It left scars not just on bodies and villages, but on hearts and minds. To walk through a town in the years after was to see absence everywhere. Empty cottages, silent fields, vacant chairs at the hearth. And yet, life returned. Crops sprouted again, bells rang once more, and children played where silence had reigned. The winter of the plague, cold and merciless, taught people both the fragility and the endurance of human life. Death had come swiftly and mercilessly, but humanity, though shaken, survived. And in the quiet resilience of those who remained, in the rebuilding of homes and the planting of seeds, the medieval world found its way forward, carrying the memory of shadows into the light of spring. After the darkness of plague and the long winters of medieval life, something remarkable began to stir in the heart of Italy. Florence, a city nestled along the Arno River, became a beacon of new ideas, new art, and new ways of seeing the world. The period we call the Renaissance, literally, rebirth, was more than just a cultural movement. It was a profound shift in the way people thought about themselves and their place in the universe. Imagine walking through Florence in the 1400s. The air hums with activity, merchants haggling in bustling markets, bankers counting coins in grand halls, artisans hammering in workshops. But beyond commerce, there's something else, an awakening. Walls that once bore only religious symbols now bloom with frescoes of mythological figures and lifelike portraits. Scholars gather in quiet courtyards, rediscovering the texts of ancient Greece and Rome, their words sparking debates late into the night. The city was alive with curiosity. At a time when much of Europe still clung to the rhythms of feudal life, Florence embraced change. Wealth from trade and banking gave its citizens resources to invest in more than survival. Families like the Medici, powerful and ambitious, poured fortunes into supporting painters, sculptors, architects, and philosophers. Patronage turned art into a language of prestige, but it also gave birth to genius. Without the Medici's gold, perhaps names like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci might never have reached the world. For artists, this was no ordinary age. They looked beyond the rigid lines of medieval art, seeking instead to capture the human form in its fullness and truth. Paintings came alive with depth and perspective. Sculptures revealed muscles tensed in motion, faces carved with emotion. Buildings stretched skyward with domes that seemed to defy gravity. Filippo Brunelleschi's dome for the Florence Cathedral rose like a miracle over the city, a statement that human ingenuity could rival even the mysteries of nature. The spirit of the Renaissance wasn't confined to canvas and stone. It pulsed in the written word too. Scholars dusted off ancient manuscripts, translating Plato and Aristotle, Cicero and Virgil. These rediscovered voices from antiquity blended with Christian thought to create new philosophies of human dignity and potential. Humanism, as it came to be called, placed man, not just God, at the center of study. It suggested that life on earth was not merely a preparation for heaven, but a stage worthy of exploration and beauty in its own right. For ordinary people, the changes rippled outward in subtle ways. Guilds organized artists and craftsmen, shaping the identity of the city. Markets overflowed not only with bread and cloth, but also with books. Thanks to the printing press, knowledge could now be shared more widely than ever before. Literacy grew, and with it, imagination. A child in Florence could dream not only of farming or trading, but also of painting, inventing, or writing. Possibility was in the air. Yet the Renaissance was not a paradise. Florence was a city of contrasts, brilliance and brutality, wealth and poverty, faith and doubt. Political rivalries simmered beneath its cobblestones. The same Medici who nurtured artists also schemed to maintain power, and their enemies plotted in turn. Religious fervor, too, sometimes clashed with humanist ideas. Friar Savonarola, for example, preached fiery sermons against worldly excess, leading bonfires that consumed books, paintings, and luxuries. For all its light, the Renaissance carried shadows. Still, the energy of renewal was undeniable. Consider Leonardo da Vinci, sketching his flying machines, dissecting cadavers to map the secrets of anatomy, and painting faces whose eyes still follow us today. Or Michelangelo, carving David from stone, transforming marble into a symbol of strength and beauty. Or Botticelli, whose Birth of Venus dared to place myth and sensuality on the same scale as sacred art. These were works that whispered that human beings are capable of greatness. Florence's streets bore witness to these transformations. Imagine an evening walk through the Piazza della Signoria, statues glowing in torchlight, voices drifting from open taverns, the scent of bread and wine in the air. People gathered not only for trade, but to watch public debates, to hear poets recite verses, to marvel at artists unveiling their work. The city itself became a canvas, its beauty designed to reflect the rebirth of thought and imagination. For those who lived through it, the Renaissance must have felt like standing at the threshold of a new dawn. After centuries marked by plague, famine, and the heavy grip of tradition, here was proof that life could be more. That beauty, curiosity, and learning could shape not just individuals but entire societies. And yet, much like dawn itself, it was fragile and fleeting. Wars and political upheavals threatened Florence. Rival cities sought to steal its glory. Artists sometimes struggled for commissions, and scholars wrestled with the balance between faith and reason. But the spark, once lit, could not be extinguished. The Renaissance spread outward, north to France, west to Spain, across the Alps into Germany, and eventually far beyond Europe's borders. Florence had lit the torch, and the world carried it forward. The rebirth of curiosity did not erase suffering or end hardship, but it offered something equally powerful: hope. A belief that the human mind, in all its wonder, could uncover truth, shape beauty, and imagine futures brighter than the past. As the bells of Florence rang across the river and echoed in the hills, they carried more than sound. They carried the heartbeat of an age awakening, one that still whispers to us today: life is worth exploring, and the dawn of curiosity never truly ends. The year 1492 has become a dividing line in world history. On one side lies the familiar world of medieval Europe, bounded by maps that ended in sea monsters and "here be dragons." On the other side stretches a world suddenly larger, more connected, and more complicated than anyone in Europe had ever imagined. When Christopher Columbus set sail across the Atlantic, carrying hopes of finding a quicker route to Asia, he inadvertently opened the door to centuries of exploration, conquest, exchange, and upheaval. Picture the docks of Palos de la Frontera in Spain that summer. 3 ships, tiny by modern standards, rock gently at anchor. The Niger, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Sailors whisper nervously about the vast unknown sea ahead. Some believe the voyage will lead them to new riches. Others fear they will sail off the edge of the earth. Columbus, ambitious and stubborn, stands at the center of it all, convinced he can reach the east by sailing west. The crossing was no easy adventure. Storms lashed the fragile ships, supplies ran thin, and anxiety grew with every empty horizon. After weeks of endless water, the crew threatened mutiny. Then, in October, a cry from the lookout, "Land," changed everything. What they saw were not the spice, rich ports of Asia, but islands in the Caribbean, home to peoples who had lived there for generations. For Columbus and his patrons, Spain's King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, the discovery was both triumph and opportunity. To them, these new lands represented wealth, gold, crops, and souls to convert. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, however, it was the beginning of an upheaval that would transform their lives in ways unimaginable. The first encounters between Europeans and indigenous communities were moments of wonder, curiosity, and misunderstanding. Columbus described the people he met as generous and welcoming, noting their skill in navigation and their rich traditions. But beneath his words lay a darker intent to claim land, to take resources, and to assert European power. In this clash of worlds, curiosity soon gave way to conquest. What followed 1492 was not a single moment, but the beginning of an era, the age of exploration. Other sailors soon followed Columbus: Vespucci, Cabot, Magellan, Cortes, Pizarro. Their voyages stretched across oceans, carving new paths that connected Europe, Africa, Asia and the Americas. Goods, ideas, and cultures began to flow across these routes. Historians call this the Columbian Exchange, a movement that forever reshaped human life. From Europe came wheat, cattle, horses, and firearms. From the Americas came corn, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, and tobacco. The humble potato, for instance, would feed millions across Europe in the centuries to come, while sugarcane grown in Caribbean plantations reshaped economies and diets alike. Yet this exchange carried shadows. As well, diseases like smallpox and measles spread from Europe to the Americas, devastating indigenous populations who had no immunity. Entire communities were wiped out, and cultures that had thrived for centuries faced destruction. For Europe, exploration fueled dreams of empire. Spain and Portugal carved vast territories across the Americas, followed by England, France, and the Netherlands. Fortunes were made, kingdoms grew richer, and European cities bustled with goods from far-off lands. But this wealth was often built on exploitation. Indigenous peoples were enslaved or displaced, and the transatlantic slave trade began, bringing unimaginable suffering to millions from Africa. The New World was not new at all. It had been home to thriving civilizations, but European colonization reshaped it forever. At home, news of Columbus's voyages spread rapidly. Thanks to the printing press, stories of the new lands reached eager audiences across Europe. Maps were redrawn, filled with strange coastlines and names that hinted at mystery. For a merchant in Venice, a farmer in France, or a scholar in Germany, the world suddenly felt both larger and more connected. The medieval imagination of a bounded earth gave way to visions of infinite horizons. Yet, amid the conquests and commerce, there were moments of genuine human connection. Mariners learned from indigenous navigators. New foods enriched diets. Languages blended, and cultures influenced one another in unexpected ways. A European child biting into his first tomato or sipping chocolate for the first time was tasting the fruits of a changed world. For those who lived through it, 1492 was not a single turning point, but the beginning of countless stories of adventure and curiosity, of hope and devastation, of discovery and loss. It was a reminder that history is rarely simple. For every tale of gold and glory, there was another of hardship and grief. When we look back at the age of exploration, it is tempting to see it only through the sails of Columbus's ships or the grandeur of European empires. But beneath those grand narratives were millions of everyday lives. Indigenous farmers who saw strangers arrive on their shores. African men and women torn from their homelands. Sailors who risk everything for uncertain rewards. Families in Europe who tasted maize or potatoes for the first time. Their stories remind us that history's waves ripple far beyond its captains and kings. As the 16th century dawned, the world had been permanently altered. Oceans no longer marked the edge of maps, but became highways of exchange. New questions about humanity, faith, and empire filled the air. The voyage of Columbus and those who followed him had set humanity on a course toward a truly global history. One filled with light and shadow, promise and peril. The bells that rang in Spain in 1492 marked more than a voyage's success. They marked the beginning of an age where no corner of the earth would remain untouched by the sails of exploration. And from that moment forward, the world would never again feel as small or as certain as it had before. Before Columbus ever set sail, before European sails dotted the horizon, the Americas were already alive with history, culture, and complexity. Far from being empty wilderness, the continents teemed with diverse civilizations, each with its own traditions, beliefs, and innovations. To understand the true impact of 1492, we must first step back into the world that existed before contact. a world where indigenous nations thrived, adapting to landscapes as varied as icy tundra, dense forests, sun-scorched deserts, and fertile river valleys. Imagine for a moment drifting over this vast land. To the north, great herds of bison thunder across the plains, their migration shaping the lives of the nomadic peoples who follow them. In the woodlands, villages of longhouses and wigwams stand beneath towering trees, their inhabitants skilled in farming, fishing, and trade. Along mighty rivers, canoes glide silently across the water, carrying goods, messages, and stories between communities. The Mississippian culture, centered near present-day Cahokia, left behind evidence of massive earthwork mounds. These towering structures, some larger at their base than Egypt's Great Pyramid, served as ceremonial and political centers. At its height, Cahokia may have been home to tens of thousands, bustling with marketplaces, religious rituals, and diplomatic councils. It reminds us that urban life was not exclusive to Europe or Asia. Cities rose and fell in the Americas long before Columbus. Further south, the Mayans of Central America built cities of stone that shimmered in the jungle light. Their temples and pyramids climbed toward the sky, while their astronomers tracked the movement of stars with astonishing precision. Mathematics, hieroglyphic writing, and art flourished here, proving that intellectual and scientific achievements were not bound to the Old World. Though many great Maya cities had declined by 1492, their legacy lived on in the smaller communities and in the rhythms of their calendar and language. In the highlands of the Andes, the Inca Empire was thriving. Their domain stretched for thousands of miles along South America's spine, connected by an astonishing network of roads and suspension bridges that rivaled those of Rome. Farmers carved terraces into steep mountainsides, coaxing crops like potatoes and quinoa from the rugged earth. Their capital, Cusco, was a city of stone and gold, where temples gleamed with sunlight and rulers claimed divine descent. The Incas showed what human ingenuity could achieve, even in the most challenging landscapes. Across Mesoamerica, the Aztec Empire stood as a rising power. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, sat like a jewel on the waters of Lake Texcoco. Canals, floating gardens, and causeways made it a marvel of engineering. Markets buzzed with activity, selling cocoa, feathers, jade, and obsidian. Religion infused every corner of life, with ceremonies and rituals designed to honor their gods. To walk the streets of Tenochtitlan was to enter one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the world at the time. Larger, in fact, than many European capitals. Yet not all indigenous peoples lived in great empires or sprawling cities. In the far north, the Inuit carved out life on frozen shores, crafting igloos from snow, hunting seals and whales, and navigating icy waters with kayaks. In the deserts of the American Southwest, the ancestral Pueblones built remarkable cliff dwellings, their homes nestled into canyon walls. These stone communities spoke of resilience and adaptation, proving that even the harshest environments could sustain life through knowledge and tradition. Across the continent, indigenous nations lived in balance with their environments. Some practiced large-scale agriculture, growing maize, beans, and squash, the Three Sisters, that sustained millions. Others relied on hunting, fishing, or gathering, following seasonal rhythms that connected them to the land. Trade routes stretched for hundreds of miles, linking people from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Andes to the Amazon. Goods and ideas flowed freely, weaving a network of human connection that crossed mountains and rivers long before Europeans arrived. These societies also carried rich spiritual traditions. Many believed in a sacred bond between humans, animals, and the earth itself. Rituals and ceremonies honored the cycles of seasons, the hunt and the harvest. Storytelling passed wisdom through generations, ensuring that memory and identity lived on even without written words. For each community, history was not just something to record, but something to live, breathe, and carry forward. When Europeans finally set foot in the Americas, they encountered worlds every bit as complex as their own. Yet too often, early accounts dismissed indigenous achievements, seeing only what could be conquered or exploited. But when we pause and look deeper, we see a truth far more powerful. The Americas were already home to civilizations of extraordinary depth, resilience, and imagination. Life before 1492 was not static. Societies rose and fell, empires expanded and fractured, and communities adapted to shifting climates and pressures. Change was constant, driven by human creativity and struggle, just as it was in Europe, Asia, or Africa. To paint the Americas as untouched wilderness is to ignore the vibrant history of the people who shaped them. And so, as the sails of Columbus cut across the Atlantic, the continents he approached were anything but empty. They were lands of cities and villages, of farmers and hunters, of artists and engineers. They were lands where people sang songs to the stars, where children played in the dust, where rulers sat in courts of stone, and where elders told stories beside the fire. In remembering indigenous America before 1492, we honor the truth that history does not begin with discovery. It begins with people, millions of them, living, dreaming, and building long before strangers arrived on their shores. Their stories are the foundation of the continents themselves. And though colonization would forever alter their paths, their legacies endure in languages, traditions, and communities that still thrive today. Before the tide of conquest swept across the Atlantic, the Americas were already whole worlds of their own. And it is there, in that richness, that we must begin if we wish to truly understand the chapters that follow. The year was 1620, and the Atlantic stretched vast and unforgiving before a small, weather-beaten ship called the Mayflower. On board, more than 100 passengers endured cramped quarters, foul air, and the ceaseless roll of waves. They were not all alike. Some were religious separatists fleeing persecution. Others were adventurers seeking fortune. But together they would carve their place in history as the Pilgrims of Plymouth. For 66 long days, the ship lurched westward, storms battering its sails and tempests flooding its decks. Seasickness weakened many, and disputes broke out in the claustrophobic space. Yet amid the hardship, a sense of purpose sustained them, the dream of a new life across the ocean. When at last land appeared on the horizon, Cape Cod, Massachusetts, the relief was palpable. They had arrived, though not where they had planned. The Pilgrims had intended to settle near the Hudson River, but storms and dwindling supplies forced them to remain farther north. Before setting foot on land, they knew they needed unity. So they drafted a document, the Mayflower Compact, that bound them to govern together for the general good of the colony. In that moment, with ink on paper, they laid the foundation for self-government in America, a seed that would one day grow into larger ideals of democracy. Stepping ashore in late November, the settlers faced a landscape that was beautiful but unforgiving. The forests whispered with unfamiliar sounds, the soil was untested, and the air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter. Shelter became the first priority. They hastily built crude huts, but the cold crept through the cracks, and the settlers soon discovered the true enemy, disease and hunger. That first winter was devastating. Nearly half of the original group perished, men, women, and children alike. The living buried the dead in unmarked graves, hiding their losses from watching eyes. fearful of appearing weak. Those who survived did so through sheer endurance, and the determination that their sacrifice must not be in vain. Yet survival was not theirs alone to claim. With the arrival of spring came an encounter that changed everything. The Wampanoag people, who had lived on this land for generations, approached cautiously but offered a lifeline. Through Squanto, a man who spoke English after years of extraordinary captivity abroad, the Pilgrims learned how to plant corn with fish as fertilizer, how to fish the rivers, and how to navigate the rhythms of the land. Squanto's story was one of tragedy and resilience, but his guidance proved indispensable to the fragile colony. With this newfound knowledge, the settlers planted crops, repaired their homes, and began to hope. Slowly, the colony gained a foothold. Trade and uneasy alliances grew with the Wampanoag under their leader, Massasoit. Though tensions between cultures simmered beneath the surface, in those first years cooperation was essential. Each side relied on the other. The Pilgrims for food and guidance, the Wampanoag for allies in a world increasingly touched by European ships. By the fall of 1621, after months of toil, the harvest was gathered. Grain filled the storehouses, game hung ready to be smoked, and the colony breathed for the first time without fear of starvation. To give thanks, the Pilgrims and their Wampanoag allies shared a feast, a moment remembered centuries later as the first Thanksgiving. Historians debate its details, but the essence endures: a fragile colony, pausing to celebrate survival, abundance, and the unexpected bonds of human connection. Yet Plymouth was never free from struggle. New settlers arrived, straining resources. Disputes over land and culture brewed beneath the surface, foreshadowing future conflicts between Europeans and native peoples. The colony remained small, its survival never guaranteed, but its symbolic weight grew large. In the story of America, Plymouth became a cornerstone of migration, endurance, and the blending of worlds. What made the Pilgrims' story endure was not perfection, but perseverance. They were ordinary people cast into extraordinary circumstances. Their survival purchased with hardship and loss. They endured a winter that seemed certain to erase them, yet they endured. And though the legacy of Plymouth is tangled, marked by both cooperation and the beginnings of colonization, it holds within it a truth. New beginnings are often born in the crucible of struggle. As centuries passed, the tale of Plymouth was retold in many ways. Sometimes it was romanticized, the Pilgrims painted as noble founders of a nation. Other times it was critique, their presence understood as the opening chapter in the displacement of indigenous peoples. The reality lies in both. Plymouth was fragile, imperfect, and flawed, yet it was also a story of resilience, survival, and the weaving of lives across cultural divides. When we picture those weary settlers, gathered around a rough wooden table, we might see more than a quaint holiday origin. We see human beings who crossed an ocean for hope, who endured loss unimaginable, and who found survival not alone, but in connection with one another and with the people whose land they now called home. And so, the story of Plymouth lives on, not just as a symbol of beginnings, but as a reminder history is not simple. It is the story of people striving, failing, enduring, and sometimes succeeding against the odds. It is in that fragility that Plymouth's legacy endures. In the quiet cobblestone streets of Boston, a storm was brewing. By the mid-1700s, the American colonies were no longer just outposts of the British Empire. They were thriving, restless, and beginning to sense their own identity. Yet the shadow of London loomed large. Taxes, trade restrictions, and the constant reminder that decisions were made an ocean away stirred resentment in colonial hearts. The whispers of revolution began here. in taverns, meeting halls, and the crowded lanes of a bustling port city. Boston was alive with contradictions. Merchants unloaded cargoes from across the globe, while British soldiers patrolled the docks. Town criers shouted the latest decrees, and broadsides plastered to walls carried fiery essays from men like Samuel Adams. In the pubs and coffee houses, debates raged over liberty, loyalty, and what it meant to be a subject of the crown. For ordinary citizens, dock workers, shopkeepers, apprentices, daily life was inseparable from politics. Every stamp, every tax, every ship searched for smuggled goods added weight to the growing tension. The Stamp Act of 1765 had already sparked outrage, forcing colonists to pay for stamped paper on everything from newspapers to legal documents. Protests grew louder when Parliament followed with the Townshend Acts, placing duties on tea, glass, and paint. To many colonists, these were not just economic burdens, but symbols of tyranny. Why should people thousands of miles away dictate their lives without their consent? The rallying cry, "No taxation without representation," was born in these streets. Then came the soldiers. Redcoats were sent to Boston to enforce British authority, their bright uniforms a daily reminder of imperial power. To the colonists, their presence was an insult, a provocation. Tensions boiled over in 1770, when a confrontation between townsfolk and soldiers turned violent. Snowballs gave way to rocks, shouts to musket fire. 5 colonists fell that night, the event immortalized as the Boston Massacre. Patriots seized on the moment, their pamphlets and engravings painting the fallen as martyrs of liberty. But it was tea that tipped the scales. When Parliament insisted on its right to tax the colonies through the Tea Act, the people of Boston answered with defiance. On a December night in 1773, men disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded ships in the harbor. With deliberate calm, they split open chests of tea and spilled their contents into the water, turning Boston Harbor into a dark, bitter brew. The Boston Tea Party was both a protest and a declaration. The colonies would not bow quietly. The British response was swift and severe. The Coercive Acts, known to the colonists as the Intolerable Acts, closed Boston's harbor, restricted town meetings, and tightened the grip of royal authority. Rather than breaking resistance, the measures fanned the flames. Across the colonies, sympathy for Boston grew. Riders carried news of the crackdown along dusty roads, spreading outrage from village to village. Unity, once a fragile dream, began to take shape. Amid this ferment, a network of secret committees sprang up, the Sons of Liberty, the Committees of Correspondence. Their words spread faster than muskets could be loaded. In taverns, whispers grew bolder, and plans took form. Liberty was no longer just an idea, it was becoming a movement. The night of April 18, 1775, carried the tension of years. In Boston, British troops prepared to march out toward Concord, aiming to seize colonial weapons and arrest rebel leaders. But the Patriots were ready. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott rode through the countryside, their hoofbeats striking sparks on the road. Carrying a message that has echoed through history, the British are coming. Lanterns glowed in the Old North Church, silent signals to waiting eyes. Across the countryside, militia men, farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, grabbed their muskets and prepared to defend their homes. When dawn broke over Lexington Green, the world shifted. Colonial militia stood in the morning mist, a thin line facing seasoned British troops. No one knows who fired the first shot, but its sound rippled across the land, the shot heard round the world. In that instant, whispers became revolution. Boston streets, once filled with quiet discontent, had become the spark of something far greater, a struggle for independence, for identity, for the right of a people to choose their own destiny. The cobblestones still carried the echoes of footsteps, of debates in taverns, of riders galloping into the night. Those whispers of revolution had grown into a cry that could not be silenced. The road ahead would be long and brutal, filled with defeats and sacrifices. But in those early days, when ordinary citizens stood against the might of empire, a new story was being written. A story of a nation being born, not in grandeur, but in the flicker of lanterns, the scrape of a quill on paper, and the steady resolve of people who dared to whisper of liberty, and then dared to fight for it. The summer heat in Philadelphia was heavy, the kind that clung to the skin and made tempers short. Horses stamped in the dusty streets, taverns buzzed with gossip, and the city's bells rang over a people caught between loyalty and rebellion. By June of 1776, the colonies were no longer whispering about independence. They were shouting for it. The Second Continental Congress had gathered in Philadelphia the year before, after Lexington and Concord, to decide the colony's course. At first, there was hesitation. Some still hoped for reconciliation with King George III. Petitions were sent, humble words offered. But the king's rejection of peace, and his labeling of the colonists as traitors, hardened hearts. The battles at Bunker Hill, the burning of towns, and the bloodshed spreading across the land left little room for compromise. Philadelphia's State House, later called Independence Hall, was the crucible where history turned. Inside its brick walls, delegates debated fiercely. John Adams of Massachusetts pressed relentlessly for independence, his fiery speeches igniting passion and frustration alike. Benjamin Franklin, wise and measured, warned that unity was their only chance for survival. Must, indeed, all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately. Others, like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, counseled caution, fearing the cost of severing ties with the world's most powerful empire. Then came a committee, tasked with putting into words the colony's cause. Thomas Jefferson, just 33, quiet and contemplative, was chosen to draft the document. In his rented room, he dipped his quill into ink and began to write. By candlelight, words poured forth that would reshape the world. He spoke not of petty grievances alone, but of universal truths, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These were not privileges granted by kings, but rights inherent to all. Jefferson's draft was revised by Adams, Franklin, and the Congress itself, words sharpened like blades, grievances against the crown laid out one by one. The colonists accused the king of trampling their laws, dissolving assemblies, keeping standing armies in peacetime, and waging war against his own subjects. Each line carried the weight of fury and resolve, a case presented not only to Britain, but to all nations watching. As July began, the debates turned tense. Delegates knew the risk. To sign such a declaration was to place their necks on the noose. Capture meant execution. Yet conviction outweighed fear. On July 2, the Congress voted in favor of independence. John Adams wrote to his wife, Abigail, that the day would be celebrated with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other. 2 days later, on July 4, the final text of the Declaration was approved. In its soaring preamble, Jefferson's words thundered with quiet power. That all men are created equal, that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, and that when governments become destructive, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish them. These were words meant to endure, to inspire beyond the moment of rebellion. The document was read aloud in Philadelphia's streets, the sound carrying into taverns and across public squares. Bells rang, cannons fired, crowds gathered. in New York. Soldiers and citizens pulled down a statue of King George and melted its lead into musket balls, literal ammunition for the fight to come. Across the colonies, farmers, sailors, and merchants who might never see Philadelphia understood they were no longer British subjects. They were citizens of something new, something untested. A United States of America. Yet independence was not a magic shield. The British Army remained strong, and the war stretched ahead with brutal uncertainty. Washington's ragged troops still faced hunger, cold, and overwhelming odds. But the Declaration gave their struggle meaning. They were no longer fighting for petitions or fair treatment. They were fighting for a nation of their own. The act of signing itself carried a weight beyond ink. 56 men, from New England to the southern plantations, bent over the parchment. Some signed boldly, like John Hancock, his name sprawling large enough to be read without spectacles. Others signed quietly, their hands trembling but their resolve steady. In that moment, they bound themselves together. Wealthy merchants, lawyers, all pledging their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. News of the Declaration rippled outward, crossing the ocean, reaching courts in Europe. France and Spain, rivals of Britain, took note. The colonies had declared themselves a nation, and alliances that once seemed impossible began to glimmer on the horizon. The war was no longer just a rebellion. It was part of a global struggle. But within the colonies, the Declaration also stirred deep emotions. For enslaved people, its words of equality rang hollow, yet they planted seeds for struggles yet to come. For women, who held households together while husbands and sons marched off, its promise lingered in the background, a vision of rights not yet extended. The Declaration was imperfect, but it pointed forward, a compass for generations. The summer of 1776 was one of risk and daring, but also of vision. In the sweltering halls of Philadelphia, ordinary men had claimed an extraordinary future. They had spoken words that would echo beyond their lifetimes, shaping revolutions, inspiring movements, and reminding the world that freedom, once whispered, could become a cry impossible to silence. The winter of 1777-1778 settled over Pennsylvania like a heavy shroud. Snow blanketed the rolling hills. Icy winds cut through every gap in log walls, and the Schuylkill River froze in jagged silence. Into this frozen wilderness marched the weary army of George Washington, bruised by defeat, thinly clothed, and hungry. They came to Valley Forge not because it was strong or comfortable, but because it was defensible, a place where they could hunker down, endure, and wait for spring. The revolution had not gone well in the months leading to Valley Forge. The British Army had captured Philadelphia, the rebel capital, forcing Congress to flee. Washington's men had fought bravely, but suffered defeats at Brandywine and Germantown. Morale was fragile, supplies scarce, and desertion a constant shadow. Yet Washington, tall and unshaken, guided them to this encampment 20 miles outside the enemy's grasp, determined to hold the army together. Valley Forge was no city, no fortress, just a cold stretch of farmland. Soldiers quickly set to work building huts from logs and mud, their breath rising like smoke in the bitter air. The smell of damp wood and frost clung to the camp. Each hut held a dozen men, crammed together for warmth, their blankets threadbare, their uniforms in tatters. Many had no shoes, their footprints marked in blood on the snow. Hunger stalked the camp like a relentless foe. Supply wagons rarely arrived, and when they did, food was meager. Soldiers boiled leather from shoes to make broth, gnawed on fire cakes, simple mixtures of flour and water, and went to bed with stomachs hollow. Scurvy, typhus, and dysentery spread swiftly in the cramped quarters, claiming hundreds of lives before spring returned. out of nearly 12,000 men. Close to 2,000 would not survive the winter. Yet despair was only part of the story. Valley Forge became a crucible of endurance and transformation. Washington's leadership shone brightest in those desperate months. He walked among the huts, speaking to soldiers, sharing in their hardships. His presence reminded them that they were not just fighting battles, but carrying the fragile hopes of a nation yet unborn. In February, hope arrived in the form of a Prussian officer, Baron Friedrich von Steuben. Stern but energetic, von Steuben introduced discipline and training into the ragged camp. He drilled soldiers in formation, taught them to march, maneuver, and fire in unison. The men, once an unsteady band of militia, began to resemble a professional army. Laughter and camaraderie sparked, as von Steuben barked orders in broken English, cursing and correcting with both ferocity and humor. Letters from Valley Forge tell a story both grim and inspiring. A Connecticut soldier wrote of starving, while plenty fills the markets of Philadelphia. Another confessed, "We have lived on fire, cake, and water for days." But others spoke of newfound resolve, of learning to endure. Washington himself, in private letters, admitted the pain of watching his army suffer. Yet he wrote of his unshakable belief that the cause was just and worth every hardship. Outside the camp, civilians also played a part. Local farmers and women brought supplies when they could, though not always warmly. Loyalties in Pennsylvania were divided, and some refused aid. Still, figures like Martha Washington, who joined her husband during the winter, nursed the sick and sewed clothing, lifting spirits where possible. The campfires of Valley Forge glowed not just with suffering, but with small acts of resilience. As winter dragged on, news arrived that changed everything. In February 1778, word reached the camp that France had entered the war as an ally of the United States. The soldiers, though weak, felt a surge of purpose. They were no longer fighting alone. A mighty nation stood behind their struggle, promising supplies, ships, and men. The wary fires of Valley Forge burned a little brighter. When spring finally broke the grip of winter, the army that marched out of Valley Forge was transformed. They were leaner, disciplined, and hardened by survival. Their muskets fired with precision, their formations held firm, and their spirits, though scarred, had been tested in the crucible of suffering and found unbroken. Valley Forge became more than a place on a map. It became a symbol. It showed that the revolution was not just about victories on battlefields, but about the will to endure when defeat seemed certain. It was about men who shivered together in cabins, who starved but did not yield, who endured because Washington refused to let the flame of independence die. History often remembers great battles, but Valley Forge was a battle of another kind, a struggle against hunger, cold, and despair. The victory was not measured in captured cities or fallen foes, but in survival itself. Without it, the revolution might have collapsed into dust. With it, the dream of America endured. As the soldiers marched away that spring, boots clattering against thawed earth, their breath now carried less frost and more resolve. Valley Forge had not broken them. It had made them stronger, bound them to one another, and prepared them for the long, uncertain road still ahead. In 1803, the young United States suddenly doubled in size. With a stroke of a pen, President Thomas Jefferson secured the Louisiana Purchase, buying vast stretches of land from France. Yet what lay within those millions of acres remained a mystery. Rivers, mountains, animals, and people, few in the East had ever seen them. To understand and claim this new frontier, Jefferson commissioned an expedition. The Corps of Discovery, led by two men, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Their journey began in May 1804, on the banks of the Missouri River. The corps, 45 men strong, pushed off in large keelboats and pirogues, the water slapping against wooden hulls. The river carried them into a world both beautiful and unforgiving. Along the way, they battled swift currents, sudden storms, and swarms of mosquitoes that turned nights into restless misery. Yet every mile was filled with wonder-new plants, uncharted streams, and animals no European had described in print. The expedition was more than exploration, it was survival. Food came from hunting deer, elk, and buffalo, from fishing and foraging. At times, the men feasted, at others, they went hungry, reduced to chewing roots or gnawing on scraps of dried meat. Illness struck and accidents occurred, but the group pressed on, bound by discipline and the promise of discovery. In the winter of 1804-1805, they built Fort Mandan near present-day North Dakota, where they encountered powerful native nations. The Mandan and Hidatsa offered shelter, trade, and knowledge of the land. Here, the corps also met Sacagawea, a young Shoshone woman who would become essential to the expedition. With her infant son strapped to her back, she traveled alongside Lewis and Clark, interpreting, guiding, and helping secure peace with tribes they encountered. Her presence often signaled to wary groups that the corps came not as a war party, but as explorers. Spring brought the thaw of ice and a renewed push westward. The Missouri stretched on endlessly, winding through plains that seemed without end. Herds of buffalo thundered across the horizon, their numbers staggering. Prairie dogs popped from burrows, curious and quick, and grizzly bears, massive and terrifying, tested the nerve of even the most seasoned hunters. Lewis and Clark carefully recorded these encounters, sketching and describing creatures unknown to most of the world. Then came the mountains. The Rockies rose like a jagged wall, snow-capped peaks piercing the sky. Crossing them was no simple feat. The men trudged through snowdrifts, shivering in thin clothes, their horses slipping on icy slopes. Food grew scarce. At one point, the course boiled candles and animal hides to stave off hunger. It was Sacagawea's Shoshone kin who provided horses and knowledge, making the crossing possible. Without her, the expedition might have failed. Emerging from the Rockies, the explorers followed the Clearwater, Snake, and Columbia rivers, waters that surged with power. Rapids tossed their canoes, threatening to smash them against rocks. Still, the pull of the Pacific Ocean urged them on. After more than a year of struggle, in November 1805, the corps reached the mouth of the Columbia. The sight of endless waves crashing against the shore filled them with awe and relief. They had made it to the western edge of the continent. Winter forced them to build Fort Clatsop, near present-day Oregon. Here the hardships continued. Rain soaked everything, game was scarce, and tempers frayed. But the sense of achievement steadied them. They had reached the Pacific, fulfilling Jefferson's vision. In the spring of 1806, Lewis and Clark turned back east. Their journals bulged with notes on geography, plants, animals, and cultures. They carried maps of rivers and mountains, sketches of prairie flowers, descriptions of bison herds and salmon runs. Perhaps most importantly, they carried stories of the native nations they met. Complex societies that shaped the land long before the United States dreamed of expansion. By September 1806, the corps returned to St. Louis. Cannons fired, crowds cheered, and word spread that the explorers had survived the impossible. They had covered more than 8,000 miles in 2.5 years, crossing a continent that seemed endless. Their reports opened the imagination of the nation, sparking dreams of settlement, trade, and empire. Yet beneath the celebration lay a deeper truth. For native peoples, the expedition marked the beginning of profound change. Lewis and Clark's maps and records would guide settlers, traders, and soldiers who brought waves of displacement and conflict. What was discovery for one nation was disruption for another. Still, in that moment, the corpse of discovery symbolized resilience, curiosity, and courage. They had endured hunger, storms, and mountains, driven by a spirit to know the unknown. Their journey across the rivers and ridges of the West became a story woven into the fabric of America's identity, one of exploration, wonder, and endurance. Valleys, rivers, and mountains carried the echoes of their passage long after their return. The footprints of Lewis, Clark, Sacagawea, and the corpse faded into the soil, but the story of their trek across a continent endures, a reminder of both the vastness of the land and the tenacity of those who dared to cross it. The frontier was not a line on a map, but a living edge, a place where forests thinned into prairies, where cabins rose against the vastness, and where survival demanded both grit and imagination. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, thousands of families packed their belongings, iron pots, tools, a Bible, and little else, and set out westward. They left behind the familiar comforts of towns and farms, stepping into a landscape of unknown rivers, wild animals, and endless horizons. A frontier cabin often began as little more than a rough rectangle of logs, cut with axes, dragged into place, and notched together. The walls stood without nails. The cracks between logs were stuffed with mud and straw to keep out the wind. The roof might be bark or thatch at first, until boards could be split. Inside, a single room held everything: a hearth for fire, a few crude stools, a bed stuffed with straw, and perhaps a shelf for precious books or family heirlooms. Life was crowded and smoky, but to pioneers this was home. Daily life revolved around necessity. Men rose before dawn to chop wood, hunt, and clear land. Each swing of the axe wrestled the wilderness into farmland, while traps and rifles brought in venison or turkey for the pot. Women tended to fires that never stopped burning, cooking meals of cornmeal mush, stews, or bread baked on iron skillets. They spun wool, sewed clothes, and raised children while keeping an eye on gardens that had to produce enough to survive the winter. Children, too, had no idle hands, fetching water, gathering firewood, scaring crows from cornfields, or minding younger siblings. Seasons shaped existence. Spring brought plowing and planting, summer demanded endless weeding and hoeing, autumn meant harvesting, drying, and preserving. Winter was both a season of rest and danger. Snow cut off travel, and stores dwindled fast if harvests were poor. Nights were long and cold, the cabin creaking as the wind howled across the prairie. Families huddled near the fire, mending tools or telling stories, while the world outside slept under a blanket of ice. Yet even amid hardship, there was beauty. Dawn spilled across the plains in colors, so vivid they seemed painted by unseen hands. Herds of deer moved silently through morning mists. In spring, wildflowers covered the prairies in waves of purple, yellow, and blue. The stars overhead blazed with an intensity few town dwellers had ever seen, a canopy so vast it humbled anyone who paused to gaze. The frontier was also a place of community, though cabins might stand miles apart. Neighbors relied on one another for survival. Barn raisings brought men together to lift beams, while women prepared great feasts. Quilting bees and corn huskings turned work into fellowship. Churches, often little more than log rooms, rang with hymns that echoed across the fields. Even a single letter from back east was a treasure, passed from hand to hand and read aloud by firelight. Dangers, however, never vanished. Wolves prowled in the woods, their howls chilling in the night. Bears could raid livestock pens. Prairie fires, whipped by winds, consumed everything in their path. Disease, Malaria, smallpox, or fevers struck without warning, often far from doctors or medicine. A broken bone or snakebite could spell tragedy. For settlers, everyday balance between hope and risk. The frontier also brought constant encounters with native peoples. Some meetings were friendly, with trade of furs, food, or knowledge of the land. Others turned tense or violent, as expansion pressed deeper into indigenous homelands. For native nations, the frontier was not a wilderness to be conquered, but a home, alive with ancestors, traditions, and meaning. As settlers spread westward, this clash of worlds reshaped lives on both sides, with consequences that echo through history. Despite these challenges, frontier families found joy in small things. A fiddle played at dusk set feet tapping on cabin floors. Weddings and harvest festivals filled the night with laughter, dance, and the smell of roasting meat. Children fashioned toys from corncobs or carved sticks, their games ringing out beneath towering oaks. Even hard labor carried a certain pride, the knowledge that every fence post, every acre of corn, every wall of the cabin was built with one's own hands. Stories of the frontier became legend, woven into the fabric of a growing nation. Tales of Daniel Boone blazing trails through Kentucky, of families crossing the Appalachians in covered wagons, of lone trappers charting rivers unknown to maps, all spoke to a restless spirit, a desire to keep pushing toward new horizons. For some, the frontier meant opportunity and freedom. For others, it meant dislocation and loss. By the mid-19th century, the edge of settlement had moved steadily westward, from the Ohio River to the Mississippi, then onto the Great Plains. But in each place it touched, the rhythms of frontier life remained the same: cabins of logs, fields of corn, neighbors who stood together against storm, hunger, and fear. At night, when the day's work was finally done, families often sat in silence before the fire, the crackle of wood, the whistle of wind through chinks in the logs, the soft breathing of children asleep on straw mattresses. These sounds became a lullaby. The frontier, for all its harshness, offered a life stripped to its essence: survival, community, and the quiet dignity of building a world out of wilderness. By the mid-19th century, the United States stood at a breaking point. For decades, arguments over slavery had pulled North and South further apart. Each new state admitted to the Union forced the question: would it allow slavery or not? Compromises delayed the inevitable, but tension simmered beneath the surface. By 1860, when Abraham Lincoln was elected president, Southern leaders feared their way of life, built upon slavery, was under direct threat. In December of that year, South Carolina seceded from the Union. Soon, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Florida, and Texas followed, forming the Confederate States of America. They chose Jefferson Davis as their president, declared independence, and raised their own armies. For the North, the Union could not be divided. Lincoln, in his inaugural address, pleaded for peace, but vowed to preserve the nation. The stage was set for conflict. The spark came at Fort Sumter, a federal stronghold in Charleston Harbor. In April 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire, shells bursting against stone walls as smoke filled the sky. Union soldiers, outnumbered and short on supplies, eventually surrendered. The fort's fall electrified the nation. Cheers rang in southern streets, while northern newspapers cried for action. The war had begun. Young men rushed to enlist. Farmers left their fields, clerks their offices, students their schools. They pinned flowers to their uniforms, kissed families goodbye, and boarded trains to join regiments. Many believed the fight would be quick, settled in a single grand battle. They marched off with music and flags, unaware of the years of blood and hardship ahead. The first major clash came at Bull Run, near Manassas, Virginia, in July 1861. Civilians from Washington, eager for spectacle, rode out in carriages to watch. At first, Union troops pressed forward, driving Confederate lines back. But Southern reinforcements, led by General Thomas, Stonewall Jackson, held firm. When the tide turned, Union soldiers broke and fled in chaos, their retreat clogging the roads with panic. The shock of Bull Run shattered illusions on both sides. This would not be a short war. Life in the armies was grueling. Soldiers slept in tents or under open skies, often ankle-deep in mud. Rations were hardtack biscuits, salted pork, and weak coffee. Disease, dysentery, typhoid, measles, killed more men than bullets. Letters home spoke of loneliness, fear, and longing for loved ones. Yet bonds formed around campfires, as men shared songs, stories, and the small comforts of comradeship. For families left behind, the war was a constant ache. Women took over farms and businesses, writing letters that traveled slowly through uncertain routes. Mothers scanned casualty lists in newspapers, holding their breath at every name. Children grew up quickly, their fathers' faces known only through fading photographs. The war was not only fought on battlefields, it lived in every home. The divide between North and South cut through communities and even families. In border states like Kentucky and Missouri, brothers chose opposite sides. One donned Union blue, the other Confederate gray. Stories spread of siblings meeting on battlefields, sometimes exchanging words in the chaos before fighting resumed. The war truly was brother against brother, tearing at the bonds of kinship as much as the fabric of the nation. As months stretched into years, the conflict deepened. Railroads carried troops and supplies across vast distances, while telegraphs crackled with urgent messages. New weapons, rifled muskets, ironclad ships, and deadly artillery made battles more destructive than anything seen before. Fields once used for farming became graveyards, dotted with wooden crosses and silent cannon. The North, with its larger population and industry, poured out men, guns, and iron. The South, though smaller, fought with determination, defending home ground and fueled by a fierce belief in their cause. Leaders on both sides, Generals Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant among them, rose to fame through victories and defeats that swung like a pendulum. Yet beyond strategies and statistics, the Civil War was lived in moments, the sound of a bugle at dawn, the flash of musket fire in fog, the silent tears of a soldier clutching a letter from home. It was the grinding march of boots on dusty roads, the rumble of wagons, the prayers whispered before battle. By the end of 1861, it was clear the conflict would consume the nation. Towns were turned into camps, rivers into supply lines, and whole regions into battlefields. The war tested the resilience of a young republic, forcing Americans to confront what their nation truly meant. The Civil War began with hope and defiance, with flags waving and drums beating. But beneath the noise lay the heavy truth. This was a war not only to preserve a union, but to decide the future of freedom itself. By the summer of 1863, the Civil War had raged for more than 2 years. Both North and South had endured staggering losses. Whole towns emptied of young men, families broken, landscapes scarred by battle. Then came Gettysburg, a small town in Pennsylvania, where the largest clash of the war unfolded. For 3 days in July, cannon thundered, muskets roared, and more than 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. When the guns fell silent, the ground was soaked with blood. Gettysburg was a turning point, but it was also a graveyard. In the aftermath, citizens struggled to care for the dead. Bodies lay in fields, shallow graves, and hastily dug trenches. The stench of decay drifted through the summer air. Local farmers found their land devastated, fences shattered, crops trampled. amid this devastation. The idea was born to create a proper cemetery for Union soldiers who had fallen in the battle. The dedication of this national cemetery was set for November 19, 1863. Leaders, clergy, and citizens gathered to honor the dead and give meaning to their sacrifice. The main speaker was Edward Everett, a famed orator, who delivered a 2-hour address filled with history, detail, and reflection. But it was the short speech that followed, delivered by President Abraham Lincoln, that would echo through time. Lincoln rose, tall and solemn, with his black coat and wary eyes. He had been president for less than 3 years, yet the burden of war aged him. He looked out over the crowd, beyond them to the rows of graves, and began to speak. 77 years ago, he said, reminding the nation of its birth in 1776. In just 272 words, Lincoln gave voice to the pain of a divided land and the hope of renewal. He spoke of liberty, equality, and the unfinished work of those who had died. He declared that the war was a test of whether a nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, could endure. The address lasted barely 2 minutes. Many in the audience were surprised, some even puzzled, by its brevity. Yet in its simplicity lay its power. Everett himself later admitted that Lincoln had said in 2 minutes what he had struggled to capture in 2 hours. Lincoln's words were not just about the dead at Gettysburg, they were for the living. He urged Americans to be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, to ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. It was both a tribute and a challenge. The war was not only about preserving the Union, but about redefining the meaning of freedom. For those who heard it, the address planted seeds of resolve. Soldiers in the field carried copies of it in their pockets. Families read it by candlelight, finding strength in its clarity. In time, Lincoln's words became immortal, etched into stone, taught to generations, and remembered as the very soul of democracy. Yet in November 1863, as the speech ended, there was no thunder of applause, no immediate realization of its significance. The crowd was quiet, reflective, almost reverent. The president's voice lingered in the cold air, like a prayer over the graves. The cemetery itself became a place of pilgrimage. Visitors walked among the headstones, reading names, leaving flowers, and whispering memories. Widows in black and children clutching hands stood at the markers, searching for connection to those they had lost. Gettysburg was no longer just a battlefield, it was sacred ground. Lincoln returned to Washington that evening, exhausted. Some said he felt unsure about his words, doubting their impact. But history proved otherwise. The Gettysburg Address became a touchstone not only for the Civil War, but for the American identity itself. It distilled the nation's pain, hope, and purpose into a few lines that outlasted the roar of cannons. Behind the eloquence lay a deeper truth. Lincoln himself carried sorrow. He often visited hospitals, sitting quietly with wounded soldiers, holding their hands, listening to their last requests. He bore the grief of a nation on his shoulders, and at Gettysburg, he offered a glimpse of healing through words that would live far longer than war. The Battle of Gettysburg and Lincoln's address together symbolized a turning tide. The Union had begun to push back the Confederacy, but the cost was staggering. Each grave reminded Americans of the price of division, the fragile nature of liberty, and the urgent need for unity. As winter closed in, families across the country read Lincoln's words by firelight. Some found solace, others found renewed determination. The war would continue for nearly 2 more years, but Gettysburg and Lincoln's address became a compass, pointing the way through the storm. The cemetery stands today, a quiet field of white stones under an open sky. Visitors still pause at the spot where Lincoln spoke, hearing echoes of his voice carried on the wind. His address, born in grief, endures as a promise that out of sorrow, hope can rise, and out of sacrifice, freedom can live. In the early decades of the 20th century, millions of African Americans made a decision that would reshape the United States. They left behind the cotton fields, small towns, and oppressive Jim Crow laws of the South, boarding trains, buses, and sometimes walking with little more than a suitcase. Their destination: the cities of the North, Midwest, and West. Chicago, Detroit, New York, Cleveland, Los Angeles, and Philadelphia became beacons of possibility. This mass movement, known as the Great Migration, would become one of the largest internal migrations in American history. The reasons were urgent and deeply human. In the South, life was constricted by segregation, limited opportunities, and constant fear. Sharecropping kept many families in cycles of poverty, bound to land they did not own. Violence, lynchings, beatings, and racial terror was an ever-present shadow. For generations, hope felt stifled. But the Great Migration offered a chance to breathe, to build, to imagine something different. World War I opened the first doors. Northern factories needed workers as European immigration slowed. And African American newspapers, like the Chicago Defender, spread the word jobs were available, wages were higher, and the North promised freedom. Stories of opportunity traveled by word of mouth, letters, and church gatherings. Soon, the trickle of migrants became a steady flow. The journey itself was both thrilling and frightening. Families packed into crowded railcars, their belongings tied in bundles. Mothers hushed children as the train rolled past fields they might never see again. Some boarded buses under the cover of night, quietly slipping away to avoid backlash from white employers or neighbors who relied on their labor. Every mile north felt like a step toward dignity. When they arrived in northern cities, reality was complicated. Work was available, but housing was scarce. Migrants often found themselves crowded into neighborhoods with crumbling buildings, limited sanitation, and landlords who exploited their need. Segregation followed them north, not through law but through practice. Redlining, restrictive covenants, and unwelcome stares. Yet amid these challenges, something remarkable blossomed. Black communities flourished with new energy. Churches became anchors, offering both spiritual strength and practical help. Businesses grew: barbershops, restaurants, newspapers, and theaters, creating a culture of self-reliance. In Harlem, New York, artists, writers, and musicians gave birth to the Harlem Renaissance. Jazz and blues echoed through clubs, poetry spilled from pens, and painters captured the vibrancy of a people refusing to be silenced. Detroit swelled with workers building automobiles. Chicago's South Side pulsed with jazz. In Cleveland and Pittsburgh, migrants filled steel mills and factories, transforming entire industries. With each paycheck, families bought homes, sent children to school, and carved out new lives. But the North was no utopia. Racism still loomed, sometimes violent, sometimes insidious. Race riots erupted in cities like Chicago in 1919 and Detroit in 1943, revealing that prejudice had crossed the Mason-Dixon line as well. Yet resilience remained the heartbeat of the migration. People held on to dreams, even when confronted with hostility. The Second Great Migration, spurred by World War II, carried even more families westward. California drew thousands, lured by shipyards and defense factories. Los Angeles, Oakland, and San Francisco became home to communities that still thrive today. By the 1970s, more than 6 million African Americans had moved north and west, forever reshaping the nation's demographics, politics, and culture. The impact of the Great Migration rippled through generations. Children of migrants became doctors, teachers, lawyers, and artists. Their voices filled courtrooms, classrooms, stages, and voting booths. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s found much of its strength in these urban communities, where a new black middle class had grown, where churches and organizations mobilized, and where leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. found a national platform. For many families, the migration was also a personal odyssey of memory. Grandparents told stories of cotton fields and dusty roads, of the decision to leave everything behind for a ticket north. They described the fear of stepping off a train in a strange city, and the pride of seeing a child graduate high school, something denied to so many in the South. Today, the legacy of the Great Migration lives in neighborhoods, music, politics, and family histories. It explains why jazz rose in Chicago, why Motown grew in Detroit, why Harlem became a cultural capital, and why millions of Americans trace their roots to a moment when courage met opportunity. The migration was not just a movement of people. It was a movement of spirit. It carried hope across miles of railroad track and through the doors of factories. It carried resilience into the face of discrimination, and it carried faith into communities where possibility bloomed despite hardship. Standing back, the Great Migration reads like a grand story, but for those who lived it, it was 1,000 individual decisions. A mother choosing to pack a bag, a father buying a train ticket, a teenager walking away from a field. Each step added up to a river of change, flowing northward and westward, carving out new possibilities for generations yet to come. Even now, the story of the Great Migration whispers through family gatherings and echoes in music, art, and memory. It is a reminder that history is not only made by generals and presidents, but by ordinary people who dare to move, to hope, and to believe in something better.